In the early 1970s, America was changing. The Vietnam War was raging, distrust in government was growing, and more people were questioning the idea of modern progress. At the same time, there was a cultural fascination with going back to nature, dropping out of society, escaping the chaos, and rediscovering something pure and primal. Into this moment came Jeremiah Johnson, a Western, unlike any other. Released in 1972, directed by Sydney Pollack, and starring Robert Redford, it told the story of a man who turns his back on civilization and chooses the life of a mountain man. But instead of romanticizing the wilderness, the film showed the brutal reality: hunger, cold, isolation, and violence. It wasn't flashy. There were no sweeping gunfights in saloons, no sheriffs or outlaws, no tumbleweed towns. Instead, Jeremiah Johnson gave audiences something raw, meditative, and strange. Behind the scenes, the story was just as wild as what we see on screen. Accidents, controversies, and unusual choices turned this small frontier survival story into a cult classic that's still admired today. So, let's uncover 10 weird facts about Jeremiah Johnson, 1972, you never knew. Fact 1. It was based on a real mountain man. When audiences first saw Robert Redford trudging through snowdrifts as Jeremiah Johnson, they assumed it was pure Hollywood fiction. But here's the weird twist. The film's story actually traces back to a real mountain man with a terrifying reputation, John "Liver-Eating" Johnson. Born around 1824, Johnson was said to be a larger-than-life figure of the American frontier. According to legend, after his Native American wife was killed by the Crow, he swore vengeance. Over the next 20 years, he allegedly killed more than 300 Crow warriors. To terrify his enemies, he supposedly cut out and ate parts of their livers after battle. Now, historians argue about how true these stories really are. Some believe they were exaggerated by dime novelists and campfire storytellers. Others say Johnson himself encouraged the tales to make his enemies fear him. But one thing is certain: he became part of frontier mythology. When Sydney Pollack and screenwriter John Milius worked on Jeremiah Johnson, they drew loosely from Johnson's legend, as well as the novel Mountain Man by Vardis Fisher. But they knew the full liver-eating angle would never work on film. It was too brutal, too strange, and too alienating for mainstream audiences. Instead, they transformed Johnson into a quiet, brooding figure, a man escaping civilization, not waging a personal vendetta. Still, you can feel echoes of the real Johnson in the movie's darker moments, like the long chain of revenge killings that dominate the second half. It's fascinating how history and myth collide here. The real Johnson may have been a vengeful killer or a misunderstood survivor. Hollywood softened the edges, but it left just enough darkness to keep audiences unsettled. So when you watch Redford staring out at the snow in silence, remember, behind that stoic gaze lies one of the bloodiest legends of the American West. Fact 2. Robert Redford nearly froze during filming. If Jeremiah Johnson feels cold when you watch it, that's because it was cold bone. Chillingly, dangerously cold. Unlike many westerns filmed in California or Arizona, Jeremiah Johnson was shot in the mountains of Utah at elevations of over 10,000 feet. These weren't movie backdrops. These were real blizzards, real sub-zero temperatures, and real survival conditions. Robert Redford, determined to make the character authentic, refused to cut corners. One scene in particular highlights just how far he pushed himself. There's a sequence where Jeremiah hunts in icy waters. Instead of sending in a stunt double or using warmed tanks, Redford waded into freezing mountain streams again and again until Pollack got the perfect shot. Crew members later said his lips turned blue and his teeth chattered uncontrollably between takes. Pollack begged him to let someone else step in, but Redford refused. He argued that the audience would feel the difference if he wasn't genuinely cold and wet. And it wasn't just that scene. Day after day, Redford endured frostbite risks, thin air that left him gasping for breath, and snow so deep he could barely move in costume. Sometimes, storms rolled in so quickly that the crew had to dig out equipment from under several feet of fresh snow just to keep filming. Even getting to set was a challenge. Trucks carrying equipment often got stuck in icy roads, and cast and crew had to hike with gear strapped to their backs. Redford later admitted the shoot was one of the hardest of his career, but also one of the most rewarding. In the end, the suffering shows. The exhaustion in Redford's eyes, the way his body stiffens in the cold, none of that was acting. He was living Jeremiah Johnson's struggle for survival, moment by moment, take by take. That's part of what makes the film so powerful. You're not just watching a performance, you're watching Robert Redford fight the wilderness for real. Fact 3. Sydney Pollack and Robert Redford almost didn't make the film together. Today, it seems impossible to separate Jeremiah Johnson from Robert Redford's icy stare or Sydney Pollack's rugged direction. But here's something weird. The project almost never happened with the two of them as a team. Originally, Jeremiah Johnson was conceived by screenwriter John Milius, who later became famous for writing Apocalypse Now and Conan the Barbarian. Milius had written a much darker, bloodier draft closer to the real-life, liver-eating Johnson. The tone was violent, brutal, and uncompromising, full of relentless vengeance. Several studios looked at it and said, too extreme. But Robert Redford was intrigued. At the time, Redford wasn't yet the megastar he would become with The Sting and All the President's Men. He was still building his career, searching for projects that broke away from conventional Hollywood roles. He believed Milius' story had potential, but it needed reshaping. So he approached Sydney Pollack, who had already directed him in This Property is Condemned, 1966. The two men had a growing trust, but Pollack was hesitant. He wasn't sure a quiet, slow-burning mountain man story could succeed in an era dominated by flashy action films and gritty crime dramas. In fact, Warner Brothers itself doubted the project. Executives worried it was too uncommercial. No love story, no towns, no traditional Western shootouts. They even floated other directors and actors to make it more appealing. At one point, Clint Eastwood's name was whispered as a possible Jeremiah Johnson. But Redford fought for Pollack. He believed Pollack could find the balance between rugged survival and poetic silence. Pollack agreed on one condition, that they move away from the pulp violence of the original draft and instead create a meditative, almost spiritual story. That decision reshaped the film completely. Instead of being just another revenge western, it became a meditation on isolation, survival, and man's relationship with nature. It also cemented Redford and Pollack's creative partnership. They would go on to make 6 films together, including The Way We Were and Out of Africa. So, in a way, Jeremiah Johnson was the spark that set one of Hollywood's great actor-director collaborations into motion. Without Redford insisting, it might never have happened. Fact 4. The film accidentally predicted the Back to Nature movement. When Jeremiah Johnson hit theaters in 1972, something strange happened. It connected with an audience Hollywood didn't even realize was waiting. This was the early 70 seconds. The Vietnam War had divided the nation. Cities were becoming overcrowded, and pollution was making headlines. Many Americans were growing disillusioned with modern life. Around the same time, there was a surge in interest in the so-called Back to Nature movement. People wanted to leave the chaos of cities and return to a simpler, more natural way of living. Books like Walden by Henry David Thoreau and even survival manuals saw renewed popularity. Communes were springing up across the U.S., with young people trying to live off the land. Even the idea of wilderness survival schools began to spread. Now, here comes Jeremiah Johnson, a film about a man who literally abandons civilization and carves out a new life in the wilderness. It wasn't designed as a political statement, but audiences immediately connected the story to the cultural moment. What's fascinating is that Robert Redford himself had already been drawn to this lifestyle. He was building his home in the mountains of Utah, where he would later establish the Sundance Institute. So when he played Johnson, he wasn't just acting. He was channeling a philosophy he genuinely believed in. Critics at the time noted the odd timing. Roger Ebert even wrote that the film seemed to reflect an unspoken wish among Americans to escape modern pressures. Suddenly, this slow, quiet Western was more than a story. It became a cultural mirror. And here's the kicker. The film actually influenced that movement too. Outdoor magazines and wilderness guides reported a spike in interest after the movie's release. People wrote letters saying they felt inspired to hunt, fish, hike, or even live off-grid. So what started as a survival drama became a generational anthem for escape. In its own way, Jeremiah Johnson predicted America's longing to drop out and became a cinematic symbol of freedom and solitude. Fact 5. The famous frozen mule scene was totally improvised. One of the strangest, funniest, and most talked about moments in Jeremiah Johnson wasn't in the script at all. If you've seen the film, you remember it. Jeremiah trudges through the deep snow, only to find his mule frozen stiff in place. He tries to coax it forward, but the poor animal simply won't budge. It's a moment of grim humor in an otherwise serious film, and audiences loved it. Here's the weird part, none of it was planned. During filming, the weather was so brutal that the production constantly faced delays. One morning, when the crew brought the mule to set, the animal was so cold and exhausted from trudging through the snow that it literally refused to move. The cameras were already rolling, and Redford, ever the improviser, decided to stay in character. He muttered to the mule, tugged at it, and delivered an exasperated performance that felt completely natural because it was. The laughter you feel watching it is born from reality. Redford really was frustrated with the stubborn animal. Sydney Pollack loved the footage so much that he kept it in the final cut. And that single scene became a touchstone for the film's tone. It showed that survival wasn't just about danger or violence. It was about little moments of absurdity in the wilderness. The mule, in its own way, became a kind of symbol. Here was a creature just as stubborn as Johnson himself, both locked in a battle with nature, both refusing to quit even when everything was against them. And that's what makes it so memorable. A total accident of filming turned into one of the most iconic moments of the movie, capturing the harsh humor of life in the wild. Fact 6. The crew battled real wildlife on set. One of the strangest challenges in making Jeremiah Johnson wasn't the snow or the thin mountain air or even the danger of avalanches, it was the animals. Since Sydney Pollack wanted gritty realism, the film used real horses, mules, bears, and even wolves in certain sequences. That sounds great for authenticity, but it created chaos behind the scenes. Take the bear scenes, for example. When Johnson drags a bear hide back to his cabin, audiences assume it's just a dead prop. Nope. The crew actually used a real bear carcass for the shot. Not only was it heavy and difficult to move, but the smell was overwhelming. Redford reportedly joked that the hardest part of the shoot wasn't fighting the wilderness, it was carrying that rotting animal skin. Then there were the wolves. In one nighttime sequence, Redford's character is harassed by wolves around his camp. Instead of trained Hollywood wolves, Pollack insisted on using semi-wild animals wrangled locally. They were unpredictable, snarling, and constantly straying out of frame. Crew members had to wave meat, just off camera, to get them to look aggressive. Redford later admitted he felt genuinely uneasy during the shoot because those wolves weren't acting. The horses and mules also caused endless problems. They spooked easily in the snow, refused to stand where the director wanted, and sometimes bolted mid-scene. One mule even slipped on the icy terrain and nearly dragged an assistant downhill. It was dangerous, it was messy, but it paid off. When you watch Jeremiah Johnson, those animal encounters feel raw, authentic, and unscripted, because in many ways, they were. Fact 7. The famous cabin had to be built and rebuilt. One of the most iconic visuals in Jeremiah Johnson is his lonely cabin in the mountains. It looks like it's been standing there for decades, weathered by storms and isolation. But here's the weird truth. That cabin was built specifically for the movie, and not just once, but twice. The production team wanted absolute authenticity. So instead of making a flimsy Hollywood set, they constructed a real log cabin from scratch, using the same methods pioneers would have used in the 1800s. That meant chopping timber, hauling logs, and fitting them together without modern tools. The first attempt took weeks, but when a sudden storm rolled through the Utah mountains, the cabin collapsed under the weight of the snow. Crew members were devastated, especially because cameras hadn't even rolled yet. So they built it all over again, this time reinforcing it carefully. The second cabin survived, and that's the one you see in the film. In fact, it stood for years after filming wrapped. Hikers and locals would occasionally stumble upon it, sitting silently in the wilderness, like a ghost of cinema history. Unfortunately, the cabin was eventually dismantled after becoming a safety hazard. But for years, it was a secret pilgrimage site for hardcore fans of the movie. Imagine hiking through the Utah mountains and suddenly stumbling upon Jeremiah Johnson's home. It must have felt like stepping straight into the film. Fact 8. The editing process nearly destroyed the film. As powerful as Jeremiah Johnson is today, it almost came out as an unwatchable mess. The editing process was so chaotic that Sydney Pollack later admitted he nearly lost hope. The original cut of the movie was over 3 hours long. Pollack had filmed tons of material, quiet moments of Johnson hunting, long stretches of him wandering through the wilderness, and multiple variations of survival sequences. It was all beautiful, but Warner Brothers executives panicked. They said, "This isn't a movie, it's a nature documentary." The studio demanded a shorter, tighter version, so Pollack and his team had to trim away huge portions of the footage. Some scenes were shortened to mere seconds. Others were cut entirely, including additional encounters with settlers and more details about Johnson's relationship with the Crow. The editing dragged on for months, and Pollack worried the film had lost its soul. But something miraculous happened. In stripping the story down, the movie gained a haunting silence. Long pauses, quiet looks, and wordless survival moments gave the film its meditative quality. Ironically, the very thing Warner Brothers feared, its slowness, became its greatest strength. Critics praised the deliberate pacing, saying it mirrored the lonely rhythm of life in the wilderness. In a way, the film's accidental editing crisis gave it its unique identity. Fact 9. Robert Redford took the film home with him. Some actors finish a film and move on. But for Robert Redford, Jeremiah Johnson wasn't just another role, it became part of his life. While filming in Utah, Redford fell in love with the rugged landscapes. He already owned property in the area, but the experience of living and working in those mountains solidified his connection. After the movie wrapped, he poured himself into developing his land into a retreat for filmmakers. That retreat eventually became the Sundance Institute, which launched the world-famous Sundance Film Festival. In other words, Jeremiah Johnson indirectly gave birth to one of the most important platforms for independent cinema. Even more, Redford often said that Johnson's solitude mirrored his own personality. He admitted he preferred mountains over Hollywood parties, and the film let him express that side of himself on screen. He wasn't just acting, he was living a philosophy. So if you trace it back, without Jeremiah Johnson, there might never have been a Sundance. A single snowy survival story ended up reshaping the entire future of American independent film. Fact 10. The film accidentally created a modern internet meme. Here's the weirdest fact of all. Decades after Jeremiah Johnson released, it became famous again for something its creators never expected. If you spend time online, you've probably seen the popular GIF of Robert Redford in the woods, slowly nodding his head. That clip comes directly from Jeremiah Johnson. In the scene, Johnson acknowledges another mountain man with a simple nod. It's a quiet, understated moment, but online, it's been transformed into a universal symbol for agreement, respect, or even sarcastic approval. The meme has been viewed millions of times across Twitter, Reddit, TikTok, and beyond. What's ironic is that most people who share it have no idea where it comes from. They don't realize they're watching a tiny fragment of a 1972 survival western. Sydney Pollack and Robert Redford probably never imagined that decades later, their meditative mountain film would live on in internet culture. But in a strange way, it's fitting. Johnson's stoic nod, silent, rugged, and a little mysterious, captures the timeless appeal of the character. So the next time you see that GIF pop up, remember, you're looking at a moment from Jeremiah Johnson, a film that continues to shape culture in the most unexpected ways. Jeremiah Johnson wasn't your typical Western. It didn't have a saloon or a sheriff or even a classic shootout. Instead, it gave audiences something stranger and deeper. A portrait of a man trying to survive not just against enemies, but against isolation, cold, and time itself. From the wild stories of Robert Redford's near-freezing dedication, to its hidden ties to real history, to its surprising second life as an internet meme, the film is full of oddities that make it unlike anything else from the era. And maybe that's why it endures. Jeremiah Johnson wasn't trying to be trendy. It wasn't built on spectacle or Hollywood gloss. It was raw, rough, and deeply human. A story of survival that turned into a cultural symbol and continues to nod at us quietly from the wilderness of cinema history.